Sofia found the second lease in a folder she wasn't supposed to open, looking for a supplier invoice that had gone missing. A studio apartment, 4 blocks from the restaurant she and Marco had built together over 6 years, paid in cash, under a name that wasn't his, but was signed with his handwriting. She didn't confront him that night. She didn't confront him the next morning either, when he kissed her goodbye on his way to check on the new supplier. The same excuse he'd used 11 times in the past 4 months. She'd started counting without fully admitting to herself why. Instead, she smiled, made his coffee the way he liked it, and started a countdown only she knew existed. 8 months. That's how long it would take to be ready. And on the night it finally ended, Marco wouldn't even see it coming until it was already over. What follows isn't a story about a woman losing control and lashing out. It's the opposite. It's what happens when someone decides, deliberately, to feel everything privately while building something in complete silence, and waits for exactly the right moment to let the truth do all the work on its own. 6 years earlier, Sofia and Marco had signed a lease on a rundown space that used to be a laundromat, with barely enough savings between them to cover the first month's rent. They painted the walls themselves. They built the bar top from reclaimed wood they hauled in Marco's truck. Sofia handled the kitchen and the menu, drawing on a culinary degree she'd nearly given up finishing. Marco handled the floor, the wine list, the relationships with suppliers who eventually became friends. By year 4, the restaurant had a 2-month wait list for Saturday nights and a write-up in the city's biggest food magazine. It was, by every visible measure, exactly the life they'd promised each other they'd build. Sofia genuinely believed that. She believed it right up until the day she found the lease. This channel tells stories about betrayal that comes from the last place you'd expect, and the quiet, patient justice that eventually catches up to it. If that's the kind of story you're here for, subscribe now, because there's a new one every week. Elena had joined the restaurant as a hostess 18 months before Sofia found the lease, promoted within a year to floor manager, a promotion Marco had pushed for over Sofia's mild hesitation, arguing that Elena was simply the most capable person on staff. Sofia hadn't disagreed at the time. Elena was capable. She was also, Sofia would later calculate, exactly the kind of hire a restaurant owner could justify seeing constantly, late nights, closing shifts, inventory runs, without anyone questioning why. Sofia had even hosted Elena at their apartment more than once, a small holiday dinner, a celebration for a menu launch, the ordinary blurring of lines that happens naturally in a small business where everyone works long hours together. She'd liked Elena. That detail, more than almost any other, would sit uncomfortably with her for a long time after everything came apart. By year 5, Marco had started referring to Elena, in casual conversation with regulars and vendors, as practically running the floor herself these days. A phrase Sofia remembers hearing multiple times without registering it as anything other than a business owner being generous with credit. She would think about that specific phrase often, later, and how naturally it had rolled off his tongue even then. Looking back, Sofia could trace the pattern further than she wanted to admit. Marco had started handling the restaurant's accounting almost entirely himself around a year earlier, gently taking that task off Sofia's plate by pointing out, reasonably, how overloaded she already was running the kitchen. She'd been relieved at the time. In hindsight, it had also been the exact moment the book stopped being something she checked closely. There were other small things too. Marco's late nights, handling supplier calls that never quite matched the hours suppliers actually operated. A new cologne she didn't recognize, worn specifically on nights he came home late. A hotel loyalty email that popped up on the shared iPad once, for a hotel neither of them had ever mentioned staying at, gone from his inbox by the time she thought to look again. Each detail alone was nothing. Stacked together, months later, they formed a shape she'd simply refused to look at directly until the lease made it impossible not to. She also remembered, with particular clarity once she started actively reconstructing the timeline, a night about 10 months earlier when Marco had come home smelling faintly of a specific brand of candle. One Sofia recognized only because Elena had mentioned loving it during a staff gift exchange. At the time, she'd assumed it was simply from the restaurant. It hadn't occurred to her to ask why it lingered so strongly on his jacket. Once Sofia started actually looking, the picture assembled itself faster and more completely than she was prepared for. The lease was real, signed 8 months earlier, for a studio 4 blocks away, paid through a business account Marco had quietly opened under a slightly modified version of the restaurant's name. Close enough to pass a glance, different enough to keep it separate from the account Sofia still had access to. Cross-referencing the restaurant's actual books against the modified account took her 3 long nights after Marco went to bed. What she found wasn't just an affair, it was theft, dressed up as normal operating expenses. Over the past year, roughly $60,000 had been quietly diverted from the restaurant's revenue into the second account, disguised as inflated supplier payments, a fake consulting retainer, and a maintenance contract for equipment repairs that, as far as Sofia could tell, had never actually been performed. Alina's name appeared as an authorized signer on the second account, added 4 months after her promotion to floor manager. Sofia sat with that specific detail longer than any other. It wasn't just betrayal in the abstract. It was Marco actively building an entire parallel life, funded by money the two of them had bled for, with a woman Sofia had personally trained, defended in staff meetings, and once, in an especially bitter irony, given advice to about handling a difficult breakup of her own. She also found, buried in a folder of old text message backups Marco had never bothered deleting from an outdated phone in a drawer, the exact date the affair had started, 11 months earlier, 4 days after Alina's promotion. It gave the entire timeline a shape that made the betrayal feel less like a moment of weakness and more like something that had been quietly planned almost from the beginning. She closed the laptop somewhere around 3 in the morning. She didn't cry, not yet. She made a list instead, the first of many she'd make over the coming months, this one titled simply, "What I Actually Own." That list started small, the exact percentage of the business legally hers, the equipment she'd personally purchased with her own inheritance 2 years earlier, the recipes that existed only in her handwriting in a notebook Marco had never once opened. By the time she finished it, somewhere past 4 in the morning, it had become the first document in what would eventually be an entire folder of careful, methodical preparation, one she kept, from that night forward, on a laptop Marco didn't know existed. The restaurant had been, for 6 years, the single clearest expression of who Sofia was. Every plate that left her kitchen carried a piece of her actual identity, not just a job. Discovering that the person she'd built it with had spent the last year quietly hollowing it out, funneling their shared success into a second life with someone Sofia had mentored, wasn't just heartbreak. It was a specific, disorienting kind of grief, mourning a version of her own life she'd been living inside for a year without knowing it was already partly fictional. There was a particular moment, about 4 days after the discovery, that Sofia describes as the hardest of the entire process. Alina asked her, cheerfully, completely unaware, for advice on a wine pairing for a table of regulars. Sofia gave her a genuinely good answer, professional, warm, exactly as she would have any other day, and then excused herself to the walk-in cooler, where she stood alone in the cold for 4 minutes before returning to the floor with a steady smile back in place. She'd later described those 4 minutes as the moment she understood exactly what the next several months were going to cost her, not financially, but in the sheer discipline of holding 2 completely different realities in her head at once, one she performed for everyone around her, and one only she was allowed to know existed yet. She didn't tell a single person outside her own head what she'd found. Not her sister, not her closest friend on staff, not a lawyer, not yet. She needed, first, to understand exactly what she was dealing with, before she let anyone else's reaction shape what she did next. There were nights during that first month when the performance nearly cracked. Marco would reach for her hand across the dinner table, an old, familiar habit from years earlier, and Sofia would have to consciously decide, in real time, whether to pull away or let it happen, calculating which reaction would look more normal to a man who had no idea he was being watched that closely for the first time in years. Sofia made a decision within the first week that shaped everything that followed. She wasn't going to confront Marco the moment she had proof. A confrontation now, with nothing else in place, would hand him exactly the outcome he'd probably assume was coming. A messy fight, a public split, and a legal battle over ownership that could easily drag on for years while the restaurant they'd both built bled out from the distraction. She wanted something more specific than an argument she might win emotionally, but lose practically. She wanted full, undeniable proof, complete legal protection for her own ownership stake, and a moment of her own choosing to make the truth impossible for either Marco or Alina to spin, deny, or soften. That meant living, for the next several months, as the version of herself Marco still believed existed. A slightly tired but devoted business partner, distracted by the demands of a growing restaurant, with absolutely no idea what he'd been doing for the past year. It was, she'd say later, the hardest performance of her life, and also the one that ultimately worked exactly as planned. She allowed herself one small ritual to make the silence bearable. Every night after Marco fell asleep, she'd write, by hand, in a notebook she kept hidden in her gym bag, exactly what she'd noticed that day, what she'd learned, and what she still needed to find out. It wasn't strategy exactly, not yet. It was a way of making sure the version of herself who knew the truth didn't disappear entirely underneath the version everyone else still saw. By the third week, that notebook had become something closer to a plan than a diary, dates, numbers, names, small tasks to complete before the next entry. Sofia never once let it leave the gym bag during the day, and never once let Marco see her carry it, treating it with the same careful discretion he'd apparently been treating an entire second apartment for the better part of a year. Over the following 6 months, Sofia did 4 things quietly, methodically, without Marco or Alina noticing anything had changed in her day-to-day behavior. First, she hired a lawyer who specialized in small business ownership disputes, meeting him twice a month at a coffee shop across town, always paying in cash, always scheduling around Marco's known schedule. Together, they built an airtight case, establishing exactly how much of the diverted $60,000 constituted outright theft from a jointly owned business, not just a personal indiscretion Sofia had no legal claim over. Second, she quietly began renegotiating the restaurant's most critical supplier relationships: the produce distributor, the wine importer, the equipment maintenance company, so that each contract listed her, specifically, as the primary point of contact and signatory, gradually and unremarkably shifting operational control of the business's actual infrastructure into her hands without a single supplier realizing anything unusual was happening. Third, she opened a completely separate personal account and began redirecting a small, carefully calculated portion of her own salary into it every month, building a private financial cushion Marco had no visibility into, mirroring, with a certain grim irony, the exact move he'd made with Alina's account, except this one existed entirely within the boundaries of what was legally hers to do. Fourth, and this took the most nerve, she began quietly documenting Alina's specific role in the financial diversion: screenshots, time-stamped bank records, internal messages Alina had carelessly sent through the restaurant's shared management software, assuming, incorrectly, that Sofia would never think to check it. None of these 4 efforts happened in isolation from her regular life. She still ran the kitchen every night, still tasted every dish before it left the pass, still smiled through the restaurant's usual chaos, while quietly building, piece by piece, the exact structure that would eventually make Marco's betrayal legally and financially irrelevant to her future. Her lawyer, a careful and unhurried man named David who'd handled a dozen similar business disputes, warned her more than once that 8 months was longer than most of his clients had the patience for. Sofia told him, every time, that she wasn't in a hurry. She'd already lost a year without knowing it. A few more months, done right, felt like nothing in comparison, especially against the alternative of moving too fast and losing everything she'd actually built. There was one night, roughly 5 months into the process, that nearly ended everything early. Sofia was reviewing bank statements at the kitchen table when she heard Marco's car pull into the driveway almost 20 minutes before his usual time. She had maybe a minute. She closed the laptop and slid the folder of printed statements into a cookbook she kept on the counter specifically for this purpose, seconds before he walked through the door. He asked, casually, what she'd been working on. She told him she was updating the restaurant's dessert menu for the spring, which was, conveniently, also genuinely true and half-finished on a different tab. He didn't push further. He never did that whole year, because he'd never once considered that Sofia might be capable of the exact kind of quiet, patient maneuvering he'd been engaged in himself. That blind spot, Sofia would realize later, was the single greatest advantage she had throughout the entire process. Marco was so confident in how completely he'd hidden his second life that it genuinely never occurred to him his wife might be building something just as carefully hidden, aimed directly back at him. After that night, Sofia changed one habit permanently. She stopped keeping anything sensitive on any device that stayed in the house overnight. Everything moved to a cloud folder accessible only from her phone, checked only during her commute, or in the restaurant's locked office. Never again at the kitchen table where a car pulling in early could cost her months of careful work in a single unguarded moment. By month 7, Sofia had everything she needed. A rock-solid legal case establishing the theft and her right to full ownership given Marco's material breach of their partnership agreement. Operational control quietly secured across every major supplier relationship the restaurant depended on. A financial cushion of her own. And a complete, time-stamped record of Alina's direct involvement. She chose the restaurant's 6th anniversary celebration as the moment, an event Marco had been planning for weeks, complete with investors, longtime regulars, the food critic who'd written their original breakthrough review, and Marco's own parents flying in for the occasion. He'd suggested it himself, months earlier, as the perfect night to announce a small expansion he'd been quietly proposing, a second location he wanted to open, conveniently, in the same neighborhood as Alina's studio apartment. Sofia agreed enthusiastically to the expansion announcement. She even helped him rehearse the toast. What Marco didn't know was that his wife had spent the past 2 weeks quietly preparing a very different kind of announcement of her own, one that would take exactly 90 seconds to deliver, and would end, by the time dessert was served, with him owning considerably less of the restaurant than he currently believed. Her lawyer had advised against making a scene at all, suggesting a quiet legal filing followed by a private conversation would be cleaner and less risky. Sofia listened carefully, thanked him for the advice, and chose the public moment anyway. She wasn't interested in clean. After 8 months of being the only person in the marriage who knew the truth, she wanted, just once, for the truth to exist in front of every single person Marco had spent years performing for. The anniversary dinner went exactly as planned for the first 40 minutes. Marco gave his toast about 6 years of hard work and partnership, raising a glass specifically to Sofia, calling her, with what looked like real affection, the reason any of it had worked at all. Sofia smiled, raised her own glass, and thanked everyone for coming. Then, instead of sitting back down, she asked, calmly, for 1 more minute before dessert, framing it as a small surprise addition to Marco's expansion announcement. She thanked the room for 6 incredible years, and then, still smiling, she explained that due to a material breach of their partnership agreement, effective as of a legal filing completed that same afternoon, she now held full, sole ownership of the restaurant. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't mention Alina by name or describe the affair in any detail in front of investors, regulars, or Marco's visibly stunned parents. She simply stated, clearly and once, that documented financial misconduct had been identified and addressed through her attorney, and that she looked forward to continuing to serve everyone in the room for many more anniversaries to come. Marco's face, according to 3 separate guests who described it afterward, went through something close to every stage of shock in real time, in front of the exact audience he'd assembled to celebrate himself. Alina, seated near the back with the rest of the management staff, understood immediately and was gone from the building within the hour, never to work a shift there again. Marco's mother, according to the same guests, was the first to stand and quietly leave the room, her expression unreadable. His father stayed exactly where he was, staring at his son with an expression Sofia would later describe as somewhere between disappointment and, unexpectedly, something close to respect for her. The legal process that followed the anniversary dinner took another 4 months to fully resolve. But the outcome had effectively already been decided that night, in front of witnesses who would later matter considerably during the settlement negotiations. Marco's material breach of the partnership agreement, combined with Sofia's airtight documentation of the diverted funds, left him with almost no leverage. He walked away with a modest buyout, considerably less than half of what his original ownership stake had been worth, and a reputation in the local restaurant scene that made opening anything new in the same city, let alone the same neighborhood, considerably harder than he'd expected. Sofia kept the restaurant, kept the entire staff except Alina, and used part of the settlement to finally renovate the dining room the way she'd always wanted, a project Marco had repeatedly postponed over the years for reasons that, in hindsight, probably had more to do with where else his money was quietly going. A year later, the restaurant is doing better than it ever did during the 6 years Marco was involved. Sofia says the 8 months of silence, the ones where she said nothing and simply built her case, were the hardest thing she's ever done, harder even than the confrontation itself, which in the end took less than 2 minutes to deliver. People sometimes ask her if she regrets waiting that long instead of confronting him the moment she found the lease. She always gives the same answer. The version of her that found that lease wanted to burn the whole restaurant down out of pure rage that same night. The version of her that waited kept the restaurant, kept her dignity, and made sure the ending happened entirely on her own terms, in front of exactly the people who needed to see it. If this story reminded you that patience can be its own kind of weapon, subscribe, because next week we're telling another story about the betrayal nobody sees coming, and the reckoning that finds its way there anyway. What would you have done? Confronted him the moment you found the lease, or built the case first like Sofia did? Tell us in the comments. Sometimes the most complete kind of justice isn't the loudest one. It's the one built quietly, for months, by someone everyone assumed was simply too busy, too tired, or too devoted to notice anything at all, right up until the exact moment she decided everyone in the room deserved to know otherwise.